Welcome to Daily Debrief, your primer on international news, brought to you by People's Dispatch. As the year comes to a close, we'll be taking a look at major developments from across the world this year and the impact on the people, as well as what lies ahead next year. Now, today we'll be looking at developments in Asia, the United States, and Latin America. Our first story is from Asia, where one of the most significant developments was the rapidly changing scenario in Afghanistan. 1 year ago, few would have predicted that Taliban would be back in power. But here they are, and Afghanistan now faces an unprecedented crisis. We have Prashant to talk to us more on this. Prashant, welcome to Daily Debrief. If you could actually tell us, Prashant, what has happened in Afghanistan in this last 1 year?
So, like you said, a very dramatic year for Afghanistan. A couple of years ago, the Donald Trump administration and the Taliban had signed an agreement which provided for the Taliban US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and there was the idea that there would be a national government. You know, the Ashraf Ghani administration, which is in power, the Taliban, everyone would sort of work together to form a government, which was what the plan was. But as the date of the US withdrawal grew nearer, the Taliban suddenly mounted this offensive. Even former enemies either combined with the Taliban or gave up quite fast. And by August, suddenly the Taliban was in complete control. Very, very few people anticipated that this would happen. And now this has, caused a massive crisis in multiple ways because this was completely off script, as you would say. And now the international community didn't really know how to respond to this. The default response of the United States in all cases, of course, is to impose sanctions, which is what it did. It froze the reserves of the Afghan bank, nearly $10 billion that it had access to. Aid was stopped. And there was a massive economic crisis that started coming into being. Now, we've discussed this issue many times before that the politics of the Taliban is odious in many ways. There's no doubts about it. For instance, even yesterday, we've had reports of women protesting because their rights are being taken away, demanding dignity, demanding the right to work. All these protests have been taking place continuously. But what the United States sanctions have done is basically to impose collective punishment where millions of Afghans are now under threat of various sorts because of the fact that these restrictions are in place. So let's just take a look at some of the numbers. For instance, the fact that it's a truth that earlier 40% of the Afghan economy was dependent on foreign aid. And most of this aid has completely been squashed or crushed after the Taliban takeover. And if you look at the numbers, for instance, some really horrifying numbers because I think about, according to the latest World Food Program reports, around 14 million people are currently experiencing acute food insecurity. And of these, 3.2 million are children under the age of 5. And many of these are expected to suffer from acute malnutrition by the end of the year. And the most alarming thing is that this report, which gives these numbers, from the last estimate in April, this estimate is November, last estimate in April, there's been a 37% increase in the number of people suffering from acute food insecurity. So that's the extent to which this crisis has mounted in the past few months alone since Taliban took over. And we do know, of course, that a lot of the crisis in Afghanistan stems from the fact that the US invaded in 2001. The US and its allies invaded Taliban. The Taliban were in no way really associated with 9/11, but they were blamed for it, right? And they invaded Afghanistan, and since then the crisis has only increased. So the international community really bears a responsibility to take care of the people of Afghanistan, to provide the necessary aid, and that is what is really kind of stuck. So in December, very recently, the UN has passed a resolution to authorize aid. Now the US has also said it will remove some of the restrictions, so we can be hopeful that in the coming months there will be an improvement. But the fact remains that the people of Afghanistan are facing a massive crisis.
Prashant, a much broader question. What lies ahead for this country now?
Right, so I think there are multiple axes on which we need to sort of examine this. Axis number one is the question of aid. Like I said, unless aid flows in drastically, unless aid flows in at a large amount, we are going to see mass starvation, we are going to see mass, difficulties of various kinds, people really struggling, even for basic necessities in Afghanistan. So that is really one axis on which the lens is on the international community, especially the United States and its allies, which are responsible for this war, which have been the main reasons, for instance, for blocking this aid. So will this aid come is question number one, very, very important question.
Okay.
Question number two, of course, is the issue of what kind of impact this is going to have on Central Asia as a whole. One of the positive signs over the past few months has been the fact that in the region there has been a bit of integration, so to speak, where the countries of the region, China, Russia, the Central Asian republics, Pakistan, to some extent even India, all of them trying to sort of work together in various ways to sort of see if there can be a better solution to the problem of Afghanistan. Because if Afghanistan descends into complete chaos, if you go back to the time period of, warring parties and, continuous civil war and conflicts, the crisis is going to affect all the neighbors. So we do see that there is a concerted effort by all these countries to sort of come together. There have been multiple meetings of various regional fora, including very recently the OIC as well, all of which actually discuss this issue, all of these bodies are continuously asked the UN and the US to make sure that aid flows in very well.
Yes.
So, that is in some sense a positive development that will continue to be an important axis in the coming months as well. The fact that can the countries of the region work together, can maybe say India and Pakistan collaborate, despite the fact that they have many, very different and divergent interests. Can they collaborate on this issue, which is not very easy, but nonetheless remains an important question. For instance, how can, say, economic development become the fulcrum of actually a new mode of developing Afghanistan, right? And then there's, of course, also the question of rights and the stability of the Taliban government itself. Two aspects here. The Taliban government has failed in delivering many of the promises it made to people. For instance, it said that there would be a general amnesty, but there have been multiple reports of former regime or security officers being killed, for instance. It promised that there would be some modicum of rights to women, minorities, but many of these promises have not been met. So we do see a situation where a continuous segment of the population is likely to be, repressed. So if that continues, it's a very dangerous sign. Secondly, of course, the fact is that the Taliban, while in control, the real question remains that how much in control are they? Are there regional interests, for instance, which could rebel against the Taliban? How stable is the Taliban government also remains a question. If the economic crisis continues, the Taliban could face challenges as well. Right now, there doesn't seem to be any major challenge, but it's a bit of an unstable equilibrium, so to speak. So that's another axis which the Taliban will have to be very careful about. The fact that it has to also keep in mind the domestic interests that are very much there. And finally, there is the question of refugees also, which is likely to get all the European countries very active. So that's also a real big question. How is the refugee crisis going to be met? So all these are, I think, vital axes to sort of analyze the Afghan question. Geostrategically, Afghanistan is being seen by the United States as left, but it has not abandoned Afghanistan. It still sees Afghanistan as an entry point. It may want to see it as a way to destabilize Russia and China, for that matter. So all these are actually key elements to watch.
Well, it's one region that needs to work towards its stability, and let's hope the coming year brings that in Afghanistan. Thank you, Prashant, for joining us. And moving on to our next story, which is from United States, which also saw some drastic developments. There was the uprising of January 6th by Trump supporters, and Joe Biden assumed power. A lot of people saw Trump as the beginning and end of a lot of problems faced by the country. But in reality, have things changed massively for the people of the country? Eugene Perrier analyzes 2021 and 2022 for the US. Take a look.
I think if there's any major political lesson we would take from 2021, I think it would be that going from Trump in 2020 to Biden in 2021 with maybe COVID as a linking continuum is there isn't that much fundamental difference between the two major political parties. I think that 2021, more than anything else, was marked by a reality and the political sphere of the fact that there is essentially zero political will in Congress, in the White House, in the sort of interrelated areas of the judiciary to actually make any significant moves that would infringe upon the rights of capital. I mean, certainly there were many promises coming into this year from the Biden administration about not only quote unquote building back from what we had seen in 2020 and the collapse around COVID, but quote unquote building back better and improving the material situation for the broad masses of working class people. And that just did not happen. And the primary reason none of that happened is that there was not enough unity amongst the political class around asking for a greater social contribution from the richest 1%, really the richest 0.01% of the population, which has seen its wealth surge massively on the backs of really what has been the worst situation for the broad masses of people, the 140 million people living in poverty in the United States more than anyone else. And so I think that is really a notable factor about where we are right now. It's a notable factor about how COVID was dealt with, is that in fact, keeping the economy open is more important than the lives of tens of millions of people from the point of view of the government. So not only is it showing that the political system in the United States is unwilling to touch the wealth of billionaires in any substantive way to help the broad masses of working people, but that it's willing to sacrifice the broad masses of working people on the altar of profit because the economy is considered so weak and the ability to provide social provision so little that even COVID-19 and a massive pandemic can't stop it. So I think it really is a notable statement 2021 about the nature of the political system in the United States, and certainly something about the rapaciousness of the rule of capital at this time. I think looking at 2022, the sort of political situation will be interesting because I think that there's going to be a political paralysis and gridlock in terms of the formal political process. I could be wrong about that, at least in the first half of the year. I mean, this often happens in election years because everyone is out saying what they're going to do, and can often then therefore not agree on as much because everyone's posturing to their supporters in order to try to get the maximum amount of votes. But that being said, I think the wild card is what happens in terms of the street, if you will, in terms of the social elements, the extra parliamentary elements of the class struggle in the United States. I mean, when you look at what has happened, that's another thing that has really marked this time. We've seen, the sort of revival of the strike, at least in a cultural way in the United States, but certainly millions of workers fighting for their rights and many of them winning. We saw in 2020 the uprising against racism with tens of millions of people coming out against the primary issue of police terrorism, but really blossoming into a greater issue around the national oppression of Black people in this country, which is also carried over many ways into the cultural sphere. So the issue of class struggle, of social struggle has also been big. And I think the question is in some ways that's been a little bit in the doldrums in the past several months. I think the question remains with millions of workers' contracts expiring next year, with the continuation of so many forms of exploitation and oppression, whether or not we are going to see a revival of struggle with people recognizing that's all that they have, that really ultimately at this stage in the game, the political arena isn't going to show them that much. That's certainly something that we saw from 2021. And then how does that move formal politics going into an election year? And I think all of that is yet to be seen, but I think in many ways, it's the biggest under-discussed story about what's big in 2022. And I think that is, what are the lessons that people imbibe from the total political implosion that we've seen over the past 2 years of, amidst the greatest crisis from pandemics to poverty to climate change, that both wings of the major political system have totally collapsed under the weight of that and offered no solutions whatsoever. In fact, sending tens of millions of people to die instead of solving fundamental problems. Whether or not the political lessons learned from that come over into the social sphere, come over into the class struggle sphere, create a new storm of millions of people taking their life into their own hands, and how that affects politics. I think it's going to be very interesting to look at all of these different dynamics in that light going into 2022.
And finally, we go to Latin America. The year saw some major electoral processes in the continent with Ecuador, Chile, Peru, Nicaragua, and Honduras. The results of these elections have changed the face of the continent in many ways. Zoe Alexandra of People's Dispatch talks about these developments. Let's listen in.
Since we are ending the last week of the year, we wanted to take this opportunity to look back at what the last year has meant in terms of the region, Latin America and the Caribbean. What are the hopes looking forward into 2022, and sort of understand what unfolded in this past year. So first, we can talk about the electoral victories and the electoral processes. Beginning in the year in February, the first round of the Ecuadorian presidential elections were held. In this first round, Andrés Arauz of the Union for Hope emerged victorious with around 30%, leading over neoliberal banker Guillermo Lasso. He also beat Yacu Perez, who is from the Pachakutik party. In this first round, many were hopeful that this would mean a return to progressive politics in Ecuador, a sharp departure from what the last 4 years have been under Lenin Moreno. While he was a member of Rafael Correa's government, has done a complete 360, should we say, when he was in office, implementing a series of neoliberal measures in line with the IMF, taking out an IMF loan, even opening up talks to the United States to use Ecuadorian air bases for their own purposes, and also furthering, militarization in the country. So in this context, Many left and progressive movements were very hopeful for this process in Ecuador, of course, since Andrés Arauz only achieved 30% of the vote in the first round. This went to a second round election in April. In these elections, Guillermo Lasso, the banker, won against Andrés Arauz. And so this saw a defeat of the progressive project, of the defeat of return to the citizen revolution in Ecuador. There were also a lot of hopes in terms of how this would impact all of the legal processes that exist against members of the citizen revolution government, namely against Rafael Correa. Those charges still hold, and Ecuador continues to be the country with one of the most intense lawfare campaigns against progressive politicians and members of the former citizen revolution government. So in Ecuador, while there was initial hope for the victory of a progressive candidate, in April he was defeated. Another key electoral process which came up quite at the same time would be in Chile. In Chile, through the process of the mobilizations on the street, which we have covered so much here at People's Dispatch, that began in October 2019, one of the key demands was for the rewriting of the Constitution. So in this year, 2021, this demand was finally brought to the people in the form of a consultation. Do the people want to have a process wherein citizens can participate in the process to rewrite the Constitution, which was drafted while Augusto Pinochet was a military dictator in the country? People overwhelmingly supported this proposal, and this was voted on in this year. And several other electoral processes occurred also in Chile, namely the one that just finished last week, which was the second round presidential elections. This was another key win. So first we have the people voting in support of rewriting the country's constitution, giving a vote of confidence to a demand that was raised in the streets. And then in the general elections where Chileans voted on, who was going to be president, who would be representing them. This presidential elections had to go to a second round, but ultimately the progressive candidate, Gabriel Boric, won against many say neo-fascist candidate who, had praised Pinochet, had said that he, oversaw a democratic process. And so this really represented a serious setback for Chile, especially in the midst of a process where people had already, voted for a process to rewrite the Constitution, and where there really had been, shifts in how people were relating to the political process. But ultimately, in December, this project of the far right, which sought to kind of curtail those advances, was defeated at the polls. And next year, a new president will be sworn in Chile, Gabriel Boric, who has, committed to furthering many of the demands that were raised on the street. So this is a very significant shift in Latin American politics, especially given the fact that Chile had been, a crucial ally in, for example, furthering the neoliberal project on the continent, private healthcare, private insurance, pensions, and other private education, and similarly, and massive support to the United States in their campaign against Venezuela. A third very crucial electoral victory for progressive forces on the continent was in Peru. There was a very contested electoral process which began in April this year. The first round of the presidential elections, as well as the general elections to elect parliamentarians. In this first round, there was a massive shock for many people. A school teacher, a member of the peasant rounds, Pedro Castillo, won the first round of these elections with a very thin margin against his other candidates. There was a record number of candidates participating in these elections, and Pedro Castillo, a relatively unknown, activist and movement leader, ended up coming in first. And then the second round, of course, was very, very hotly contested. His opponent was Keiko Fujimori, who is the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, former dictator in Peru. And once again, similarly to Chile, you have two different models and two different projects for society coming head to head. One being, of course, the far right project of Keiko Fujimori, who, wanted to continue these neoliberal policies that exist in Peru, an exclusion of the masses, exclusion of the majorities, whereas Pedro Castillo had voiced support for rewriting the constitution, agrarian reform, and many other key demands that have been raised by social sectors in Peru. And he won the second round of the presidential elections in June. It was again a very, very close race, and the far right attempted to delay this victory by imposing different legal appeal processes, questioning all of these votes. In the end, after a month, the victory was confirmed and Pedro Castillo was eventually sworn into office. But of course, this created a situation of tension. And from that moment, there's been a continued situation of tension. A lot of pressure put against Pedro Castillo's government. He's getting, very, very tested in this sense. And there's already been an impeachment motion presented against him. So this is a constant battlefield, continues to be one. Another very key electoral victory was in Honduras. Xiomara Castro won these elections, a progressive candidate from the Libre Party. She won against the candidate from the National Party, which has been ruling Honduras for the past 12 years, which has driven the country into a situation of complete chaos, of complete economic crisis, social crisis, the largest waves of mass migration probably in history, a lot of corruption, a lot of siphoning off of public funds, weakening of the public sector. And so this was a very crucial victory for the Honduran people. Into 2017 elections, there was mass electoral fraud that was committed by the same national party in order to win the elections. And so there was a lot of apprehension about what would happen in these elections. But in the end, the vote of the people, the will of the people was respected, and another victory for progressive forces on the continent were seen. And so as we come to the end of the year in Latin America, it's very important to take stock of all of these victories. The situation, the geopolitical situation, the correlation of forces on the continent has very much shifted in favor of progressive movements, of progressive forces. There is more likely to be a more favorable conditions for projects of Latin American integration, of furthering spaces of cooperation like ALBA, TCP, like CELAC, and other important bodies where Latin American leaders, for, of course, the first decade of the 2000s, were really building important economic partnerships, political partnerships, and challenging U.S. imperialist hegemony on the continent and in the region.
Well, that's all from us right now. I hope you have a good 2022 up ahead. And do keep watching People's Dispatch. Follow us, like us, subscribe to us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you.